Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on building regulations and safety laws. The stuff that makes sure those buildings we all spend so much time in actually, stay up.
And that they're safe too, of course.
Mm.
It's a surprisingly interesting world full of history and, well, a lot of really important detail.
Oh yeah, we've got some serious reading material for this one. We're talking excerpts from the Agency Legal and Statutory Requirements in Construction Workbook.
Oh, and the Localism Act overview.
Right, and the National Planning Policy Framework,
hmm
and of course the Town and Country Planning Act. I mean, it's a lot.
It is, but it's all about how we control the design of buildings and make sure those structures are safe for everyone.
Rich, let's face it, with all the potential hazards and chaos of construction, it's a pretty important topic.
Definitely.
So maybe we should start with planning permission. I mean, that's kind of the first hurdle, right? Making sure whatever gets built is actually supposed to be there.
It is. Think of it like a gatekeeper, making sure what gets built fits the community's needs. And the environment, of course, prevents, well, let's just say it prevents some pretty bad development decisions.
Yeah, like suddenly having a giant factory pop up next to your house.
Exactly. It's about making sure development enhances an area, instead of disrupting it. And this whole idea that what happens on one person's land affects everyone around them, well, it's not new.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it actually goes all the way back to Roman times here in England.
Wow, so even the Romans were worried about zoning laws.
Well, not exactly zoning laws, but they did have a system called tributum soli. It tracked land ownership and taxes, and it kind of recognized that land use was a public concern.
Oh.
And then that evolved through the Anglo-Saxons with their Danegeld land tax. So really, the concept that we need to regulate land use for everyone's benefit, well, it's been around for centuries.
Makes sense. So how does that all translate to today's world?
Well, we've got the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990 as the foundation for pretty much everything. And then the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF. That's well, it sets the overall goals and principles.
So the NPPF is like the guiding document, right? But not super strict rules, more like guidelines.
Exactly. And one of the key things about the NPPF is its emphasis on sustainable development. It's not just about building more, it's about making sure that growth balances economic, social, and environmental needs. So, building something today that won't cause problems tomorrow.
That makes a lot of sense. But practically speaking, how does someone actually get planning permission? What's the process like?
Well, the first step is figuring out what kind of development you're even dealing with. Is it residential, commercial, infrastructure, recreational?
Right, because a new house is going to have different considerations than, say, a new bridge.
Exactly. And then you need to figure out if your project falls under what's called permitted development. These are smaller projects, things that don't require formal planning permission.
So like adding a shed to your garden or something.
Exactly. But for anything bigger, you've got to go through a multi-stage process. It starts with a consultation with your local planning authority. You submit your plans, they assess them, taking into account those NPPF principles and any local policies.
And then they decide whether to give you the thumbs up or not.
Pretty much. But it's not always a simple yes or no. Sometimes there are conditions attached to the permission, things you need to do to mitigate any potential impacts.
I see. And what if they say no? What if they refuse planning permission?
Well, both the applicant and the public have the right to appeal the decision. There are specific procedures for that. It can get a little complex, but it's there to ensure fairness and accountability.
Right, so it's not just a one-sided process.
Yeah.
Everyone has a chance to have their say.
Exactly. And those appeals are really important. They help to ensure that development decisions are made in a balanced and transparent way.
Makes sense. So planning permission makes sure buildings are in the right place and serve the community's needs. But what about making sure the buildings themselves are, actually safe?
Right, that's where building regulations and safety laws come in. They're all about making sure that what gets built meets minimum standards for safety, health, and welfare, both for people inside the buildings and those around them.
So that covers everything from fire safety to accessibility, right?
Absolutely. We're talking structural stability, energy efficiency, ventilation, sound insulation, and yeah, accessibility is a huge part of it too.
So these regulations basically set the baseline for safe and responsible building practices.
That's it. And it's important to remember that these regulations have evolved over time, often in response to, well, sometimes in response to tragedies.
Oh, I bet there's some interesting historical examples of that.
Definitely. One major example is the Great Fire of London in 1666. That devastating fire led to some pretty big changes in fire safety regulations that honestly still influence how we build today.
Makes sense. Learn from the past, right?
Exactly. And centuries later, we had the Grenfell Tower fire in London in 2017, which tragically highlighted, well, some serious issues with fire safety in high-rise buildings, leading to even stricter regulations.
Yeah, that was a heartbreaking event. It really highlighted just how important these building regulations are. So how do those regulations actually get put into practice? Who's making sure builders are following the rules?
That's the role of building control. It's kind of similar to planning permission in that it involves a formal approval process with applications, plan assessments, and inspections.
So you can't just draw up some plans and start building. You have to get those plans checked and approved first.
Right. Your plans get scrutinized to make sure they actually meet all those building regulations. And once construction starts, there are regular inspections throughout the process to make sure everything's being built according to those plans and regulations.
So it's like having a, what do you call it, an accountability partner, someone looking over your shoulder throughout the whole construction process.
Exactly. And these aren't just quick glances. These inspections can be pretty detailed. It's only after that final inspection, when they've made sure everything meets the standards, that a completion certificate is issued.
Okay, makes sense. But what if someone tries to skip building control
Yeah.
or cut corners during construction?
Well, there can be some pretty serious consequences. You're talking enforcement notices, being forced to open up already completed work so they can check it, even legal action in some cases.
Wow, so ignoring those regulations can really come back to bite you.
It can. And in the worst case scenarios, like Grenfell Tower, ignoring those regulations can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, definitely a reminder that those rules are there for a reason.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got planning permission to make sure buildings are in the right place and meet the community's needs, and building regulations to make sure they're structurally sound and safe. But what about the people actually building them? What legal and safety considerations apply to construction workers?
That's where we get into the world of construction law. And that's well, it can get pretty complex because it covers a whole range of areas.
Like what?
Well, you've got contract law, commercial law, planning law, employment law, even tort law. It's a whole mix.
Right.
Luckily, there's a specific court in the UK that specializes in this kind of stuff, the Technology and Construction Court. They handle all the complex disputes and disagreements that can arise in construction projects.
So it's like having a legal team that really understands the nuances of the construction industry.
Exactly. They're the experts when it comes to all those complicated legal issues. But let's back up a bit. When we talk about safety on construction sites, what are the main laws that govern all of that?
Yeah, good question. What are the big ones?
Well, at the very top is the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. That act sets out the general duties of employers and employees when it comes to keeping the workplace safe.
So that's like the foundation of workplace safety, right? It applies to all workplaces, including construction sites.
Right. It's the bedrock. But of course, there are additional laws that address the specific risks that come with construction work.
Because, yeah, swinging a hammer or operating heavy machinery, that's a different level of risk than sitting at a desk.
Exactly. And that's where the Construction Design and Management Regulations 2015, or CDM 2015 for short, come in. Those regulations focus on planning, managing, and coordinating health and safety throughout the entire construction project.
So it's not just about reacting to hazards once they happen. It's about building safety into every stage of the process.
Precisely. And those regulations clearly define the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved, from the client and designers all the way down to the workers on the ground.
So everyone's got to be on the same page when it comes to safety.
Absolutely. Teamwork is essential on a construction site.
Makes sense. Now, what about the people living and working near those construction sites? Because let's be honest, construction can be pretty disruptive. What's there to protect those neighbors from all the noise, the dust, and everything else?
That's a great point. Construction can be a real nuisance, both literally and, well, legally speaking.
How so?
Well, in this context, the law recognizes two key concepts: trespass and nuisance. Trespass is pretty straightforward. It basically means going onto someone else's property without permission. Like if a crane swings over a neighbor's property line, or building materials get stored on their land.
So even if it's unintentional, even a slight encroachment could be considered trespassing.
That's right. And then nuisance is broader. It covers anything that interferes with a neighbor's enjoyment of their property. So that could be excessive noise from construction equipment, dust clouds, even bright lights shining from the site at night.
So it sounds like the law tries to strike a balance, allowing construction to happen while also protecting the people who live and work nearby.
Exactly. It's all about finding a way for everyone to coexist peacefully, during those sometimes noisy construction phases, and to encourage construction companies to go above and beyond just the legal minimums. There's a voluntary initiative here in the UK called the Considerate Constructors Scheme.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. That's like a gold star program for companies that are trying to be good neighbors.
Right, exactly. Their code of considerate practice encourages companies to really think about their impact on the community, the environment, and of course, the well-being of their workforce.
It's good to know there are some incentives for construction companies to be considerate.
Definitely. It's about raising the bar for the whole industry.
Now, earlier you mentioned something about occupier's liability. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. The Occupiers' Liability Acts of 1957 and 1984 establish a duty of care that property owners owe to anyone who sets foot on their property, whether invited or not. So even if someone wanders onto a construction site without permission and gets hurt, the site owner could still be held liable.
So you can't just say, well, they shouldn't have been there if someone gets hurt on your property.
Not necessarily. That's why it's so important for construction sites to be secure and for hazards to be properly managed.
Makes sense. It's about protecting everyone, even those who might accidentally wander onto the site.
Exactly. And then there's the concept of vicarious liability. That means an employer can be held responsible for their employees' actions if those actions happen during the course of their employment.
So if a construction worker accidentally causes some damage while on the job, their employer could be held liable even if they didn't directly tell the worker to do anything wrong.
Right. It's based on the idea that employers have a degree of control over their employees and should be accountable for what those employees do while they're working.
It sounds like navigating the legal landscape of construction can be pretty tricky.
It can be. There are a lot of nuances to consider.
But those legal concepts are there to protect workers, neighbors, and the public, right?
Absolutely. They help to ensure that construction projects are carried out safely and responsibly.
So we've talked about safety from all these different angles, but what about the financial side of things? What role does insurance play in construction?
Insurance. Oh, it's absolutely essential. It helps to mitigate all the risks involved in construction projects and provides a safety net if things go wrong. And in construction, things can go wrong in a lot of different ways.
Right, from a few broken tools to, something much more serious.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different types of insurance designed to cover those different risks. We'll dive into those in more detail later on.
Okay, sounds good. We've definitely covered a lot in this first part. It's amazing to see how history, legislation, and even ethics all play a role in how we design and build the structures around us.
It's a complex field, but the goal is ultimately to create a built environment that is not only functional and efficient, but also safe, sustainable, and considerate of everyone involved.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back soon to explore more of those fascinating layers of building regulations and safety laws. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're digging deeper into the world of building regulations and safety laws. And last time, we kind of left off on this cliffhanger about all the different types of insurance involved in construction.
Right, because you can't just have one policy that covers, everything. There are a lot of different risks to consider.
Yeah, so let's break it down. What are some of those key types of insurance that come into play?
Okay, well, first up is probably the most common one, public liability insurance.
Yeah.
That covers you, someone who's not part of your company, like a client, a passerby, anyone really, gets injured or that their property gets damaged because of your business operations.
So, like, if a construction worker accidentally drops a hammer and it dents someone's car, that's where public liability insurance would come in handy.
Exactly. It protects the company from those kind of unpredictable accidents that, let's face it, can happen on a busy construction site.
Right, because you can't control everything.
Right.
So what about, let's say you hire an architect or an engineer for a project. Do they need a special kind of insurance?
Yeah, they typically need what's called professional indemnity insurance. That covers them if someone makes a claim because of professional negligence. Like if there's a design flaw that leads to a problem down the line.
So if a roof starts leaking a few years after the building's finished because of a mistake in the design, that's where professional indemnity insurance would step in.
Exactly. It protects those professionals from the financial fallout of mistakes or oversights.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the workers themselves? Is there insurance to protect them if they get injured on the job?
Definitely. There's employer's liability insurance, and that one's actually mandatory in the UK. It covers claims from employees who get injured or sick because of their work.
So it's like a safety net for the workers, no matter who's at fault.
That's right. Now let's move on to some of the more specialized types of insurance. Contractors' all risks insurance is a big one. It covers a pretty wide range of risks that are, well, specific to construction projects.
Like what kinds of risks?
Well, it covers damage to the actual work that's being done, damage to the tools and equipment, and even liability to third parties.
So if there's a fire on a construction site that damages the building that's being built, that's where contractors' all risks insurance would kick in.
Exactly. It provides a comprehensive layer of protection, both for the contractors and the clients.
Okay, makes sense. What about if something goes wrong later on, like let's say a defect in the construction isn't discovered until years later?
There's insurance for that too. It's called latent defects insurance. It covers those hidden defects that might not be obvious right away but can cause problems down the line.
Oh, like if the foundation starts to crack 5 years after the building's finished, that's when latent defects insurance would be important.
Exactly. It's about managing those long-term risks.
Right, because in construction, you're not just thinking about today, you're thinking about years into the future.
Absolutely. Now, there are a couple of other types of insurance worth mentioning. Machinery insurance covers damage or theft of all those expensive pieces of equipment used in construction. And then personal accident insurance provides a lump sum payment to employees who are injured, even if it's not their employer's fault.
So it's like an extra layer of protection for the workers no matter what happens. Wow, it seems like every possible scenario is covered.
Well, there's one more I should mention, contract bonds. These are financial guarantees that a project will actually get finished, even if the original contractor can't do it.
So if a contractor goes bankrupt in the middle of a project, the contract bond makes sure someone else can step in and finish the work.
That's the idea. It protects the client's investment and keeps things moving forward.
Okay, so we've got public liability, professional indemnity, employer's liability, contractors' all risks, latent defects, machinery, personal accident, and contract bonds. That's a lot of insurance.
It is. But it's all there to manage risk, protect investments, and ultimately make sure those construction projects can happen smoothly and safely.
Makes sense. Now, earlier we talked about how planning regulations have evolved over time, and it seems like sustainability is playing a bigger and bigger role in shaping those regulations.
Wow, absolutely. The UK government has some pretty ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions, and the construction industry has a big part to play in that. We're already seeing a push toward more energy-efficient buildings with stricter requirements for things like insulation and heating systems.
So those eco-friendly homes we hear so much about, those aren't just a pipe dream. Building regulations are actually making them a reality.
They are, and it goes beyond just energy efficiency. There's a growing focus on what's called the embodied carbon of building materials.
Embodied carbon, what's that?
It basically means the carbon footprint of the materials themselves, from their production to their transportation to their installation. So it's not just about how the building performs once it's built, but about the environmental impact of everything that went into making it.
Oh, I see. So even if a building is super energy efficient once it's up and running, if it was built with materials that had a huge carbon footprint, that's still a problem.
Exactly. Traditional concrete and steel production, for example, those are pretty carbon-intensive processes. So there's a real push to explore alternative materials that have a lower impact.
Like what? What are some of those alternatives?
Well, timber is a big one. It's a renewable resource, and it actually stores carbon.
Oh, right, because trees absorb carbon dioxide as they grow.
Exactly. And we're seeing more and more buildings being constructed with timber frames or even entirely out of timber.
Interesting. What about other materials?
Bamboo is another promising one. It grows incredibly fast, so it's a very sustainable resource.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing a lot of innovation in using recycled materials in construction.
Oh, like using recycled plastic or metal in building components.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to reduce waste and reuse materials whenever possible. And it's not just about the materials themselves. There's also a growing emphasis on designing buildings for adaptability and deconstruction.
Deconstruction.
Yeah.
So instead of demolishing a building at the end of its life, you carefully take it apart and reuse the materials.
That's the idea. It's like those Lego sets we had as kids. You can take them apart and build something new, but on a much larger scale, of course.
Right. So it's about minimizing waste and thinking about the entire life cycle of a building, from its construction to its eventual demolition.
Exactly. It's called life cycle thinking, and it's becoming increasingly important in the construction industry.
So how do you see all of these sustainability trends impacting building regulations in the future, do you think the rules are going to get even stricter?
Yeah. I think they will, but I also think we'll see a shift toward a more performance-based approach to regulation. So instead of just saying, you have to use this material or you have to build it this way, the regulations might set targets for things like energy efficiency or carbon emissions, and then it's up to the architects and engineers to figure out how to meet those targets.
So it's more about setting goals and then letting the professionals find creative solutions.
Exactly. It's about encouraging innovation and flexibility within those sustainability goals. And I also think we'll see a bigger role for technology in building regulations. We already have building information modeling, or BIM, which allows you to design and construct buildings virtually. That can help to make things more efficient and reduce waste.
Right, because you can catch problems in the design phase before they become real-world problems.
Exactly. And as those technologies advance, I think they'll be integrated into the regulatory process, maybe even through things like digital twins, which are virtual replicas of physical buildings that can be used to monitor performance and compliance in real time.
Wow, it sounds like the future of building regulations is going to be all about data, performance, and sustainability. Pretty exciting stuff. But before we get too carried away with the future, maybe we should take a step back and look at the legal framework that underpins property ownership and transactions. After all, before you can even think about building something, you need to make sure you actually have the right to build on the land, right?
Absolutely. That's where we get into the world of land law and contract law, where history and legal agreements come together to determine who owns what and how those ownership rights can be transferred.
So it's like the legal foundation upon which the entire construction industry is built.
Exactly. And to really understand how this all works today, it helps to take a quick trip back in time. Did you know that the concept of land ownership, as we understand it today, has roots that go all the way back to the Roman Empire? Back then, they had a system called tributum soli, which was basically a way of meticulously recording land ownership and productivity. It laid the groundwork for a more structured approach to owning land, and that approach has evolved over centuries.
Wow, so the idea of owning a piece of land has a history that stretches back over 1,000 years. That's amazing.
It is. And those roots continued to grow through the Anglo-Saxon era with their land tax called Danegeld, and even after the Norman conquest in 1066, which brought some pretty big changes to land ownership patterns. Fast forward to today, and we have this incredibly sophisticated system of land law and contract law that governs how we buy and sell property. It's a system that's designed to ensure clarity, fairness, and legal certainty in those transactions.
It's fascinating to see how historical events have shaped how we handle property today. But when we talk about modern property transactions, what are the key legal concepts we need to understand?
Well, the most fundamental concept is land ownership itself. In the UK, there are two main types of land ownership: freehold and leasehold.
Freehold and leasehold, those are terms you see all the time in real estate listings. But I'll be honest, I'm not always sure what the difference is.
Okay, well, freehold is pretty straightforward. It means you own the land and any buildings on it outright. It's the most complete form of ownership, and it gives you the right to use the land for pretty much any lawful purpose, subject to planning permission or any other legal agreements that might be in place. And freehold ownership is indefinite. You can pass it down through generations.
So it's like you have your own little kingdom, you have complete control over the land and what happens on it.
That's a good way to put it. Now, leasehold is a bit different. It's essentially a long-term rental agreement. So you have the right to occupy and use the property for a fixed period of time, but you don't actually own the land itself. You're leasing it from the freeholder who retains ultimate ownership.
This is kind of like renting an apartment, but for a much longer period of time.
Exactly. And those leasehold agreements will have specific terms and conditions, like how long the lease is for, how much ground rent you have to pay to the freeholder, and any restrictions on what you can do with the property.
So leasehold can be a bit more restrictive than freehold.
It can be, but it also has some advantages. Leasehold properties are often more affordable, so they can be a good option for first-time buyers.
So it's like choosing between buying a car outright or leasing one. They both have their pros and cons. Now, I've heard the term conveyancing thrown around a lot when people talk about buying and selling property. What exactly does that involve?
Conveyancing is the legal process of transferring ownership of a property. It's a pretty structured process that involves a series of steps. It starts with an offer being made and accepted. Then there are searches and inquiries to make sure there aren't any hidden problems or legal issues with the property.
Because it's like a thorough background check on the property before you commit to buying it.
Exactly. You don't want any nasty surprises popping up later on. Once those searches are done, the contracts are exchanged, and that makes the sale legally binding. And then the final stage is completion, where the ownership is officially transferred and the keys are handed over.
It's a relief to know there's a clear process in place for such a big transaction. Now, you mentioned contracts, so I assume there's a lot of legal paperwork involved in all of this.
Absolutely. Contracts are at the heart of these property transactions. The most important document is the contract of sale. It sets out all the key details of the transaction, like the purchase price, the completion date, any special conditions, and any warranties that might be in place.
So it's like the rule book for the transaction, making sure everyone knows what they're agreeing to and their interests are protected.
Exactly. And contract law plays a big role in ensuring those agreements are enforceable. Now, it's important to understand that both contract law and land law work together in these transactions. Contract law governs those early stages, the offer, the acceptance, the exchange of contracts. But then land law comes into play during the completion and registration phases.
So it's like a legal tag team, making sure the transfer of ownership happens smoothly and according to the law.
That's a great way to put it. And it's this interplay between contract law and land law that keeps the real estate market ticking along.
Okay, so we've covered the history of land ownership, the different types of ownership, the conveyancing process, and the importance of contracts. It's amazing to see how this whole legal framework has evolved over time. But let's dive a bit deeper into land law. Earlier, you mentioned something about easements and freehold covenants. Can you explain what those are and how they affect land ownership?
Sure. Easements and freehold covenants are legal mechanisms that can have a big impact on how land can be used and developed. They're often overlooked, but they can have some pretty major implications for property owners and developers.
So they're like hidden clauses that can affect what you can and can't do with your property.
Exactly. Let's start with easements. An easement is a right that one landowner has over the land of another. It allows them to do something specific on or over that neighboring land, even though they don't own it.
Can you give me some real-world examples of easements?
Sure. A common one is a right-of-way. Imagine you own a property that doesn't have direct access to a public road. You might have an easement over your neighbor's land that lets you use their driveway or a path across their property to reach yours.
So it's like having a legal right to use your neighbor's driveway.
Exactly. Easements can also cover things like drainage rights, so you can run pipes or ditches across a neighbor's land, or even rights to light, which would prevent a neighbor from building something that blocks sunlight to your property.
It's interesting how these easements create these interconnected relationships between properties. But how are they created in the first place? Do you have to go to court or something?
Not necessarily. Easements can be created in a couple of ways. They can be expressly granted in writing, like in a deed or a property transfer document. Or they can rise over time through long use, which is known as prescription.
Prescription. So if someone's been using a path across their neighbor's land for years and years, even without permission, they might actually have a legal right to keep doing that.
That's right. If the use has been open, continuous, and without permission for a certain period of time, it can actually create an easement by prescription. And these easements can have a big impact on a property's value and its development potential.
So buyers and sellers need to be aware of any easements that might affect a property.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about freehold covenants. Unlike easements, which grant rights, freehold covenants impose restrictions on how land can be used. They're basically promises or agreements between landowners that regulate land use.
So easements are about giving you freedoms, and freehold covenants are about setting limits.
You got it. And most freehold covenants are what we call restrictive, meaning they prevent the landowner from doing certain things.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, a restrictive covenant might prevent you from building an extension beyond a certain size, or from running a business from your home, or even from painting your house a certain color.
It's like having a legally binding homeowners association, but just for your property.
That's a good analogy. And these covenants are usually enforced by whoever benefits from them, which is often a neighboring landowner or the original developer of the land. They can actually take legal action to prevent you from breaking the covenant.
So if you break a covenant, your neighbor could take you to court.
It's a possibility, yeah. Now, while most freehold covenants are restrictive, there are also positive covenants. Those required the landowner to do something specific, like maintaining a boundary fence or contributing to the upkeep of a shared driveway.
So it's like a legally binding agreement to be a good neighbor and share responsibilities.
Exactly. And both easements and freehold covenants run with the land, which means they bind future owners even if they weren't part of the original agreement.
So these agreements can have a really long-lasting impact on how a property can be used and developed.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to do your due diligence and be aware of any easements or freehold covenants that might affect a property before you buy or sell it. A thorough title search can usually uncover those hidden legal threads.
It's like detective work, finding those potential legal surprises before they become problems.
Exactly. And this is especially important for construction projects. Easements and covenants can really impact the feasibility of a development and even lead to costly legal disputes down the line.
So it's best to know about these things up front and factor them into your plans.
Absolutely. It's all part of responsible planning and development.
Speaking of shared responsibilities, you mentioned party walls earlier. What are those exactly? I have this image of those thin walls in apartments where you can hear your neighbor's every move.
You're on the right track. Party walls are those shared walls that separate buildings owned by different people. So yeah, that could be the wall between two semi-detached houses, or it could be the walls between apartments in a larger building.
So it's not just about noise, it's about the legal aspects of ownership and responsibility when it comes to these shared walls.
Exactly. In the UK, we have the Party Wall, etc. Act of 1996, which sets out the rules for what happens when someone wants to do work that might affect a party wall.
So if I want to knock down a wall that I share with my neighbor, I can't just go ahead and do it.
Nope, definitely not. The Party Wall Act is there to prevent disputes and ensure that any work on a party wall is done safely and with everyone's consent.
So it's like a legal framework for neighborly cooperation when it comes to those shared walls.
That's a good way to put it. And the act covers a pretty wide range of work, from building a new wall on the boundary line to altering or repairing an existing party wall, even to digging near your neighbor's foundation.
Wow, so it's not just about demolition, it's about anything that might affect the stability of that shared wall or the buildings on either side.
Exactly. If you're planning any work that falls under the Party Wall Act, you're legally required to serve a party wall notice to your neighbor at least 2 months before you start. That notice has to describe the work in detail, the timeline, and who's going to be in charge of the project.
So it's like a formal heads up to your neighbor, letting them know what's going to happen and giving them a chance to weigh in.
That's right. And your neighbor can agree to the work, disagree with it, or request certain conditions to protect their property.
So it's a way to negotiate those shared responsibilities and hopefully avoid any conflicts.
Exactly. And if you can't reach an agreement, the Act provides for a dispute resolution process, which usually involves bringing in a party wall surveyor who makes a binding decision.
So it's like having a neutral third party come in and sort things out if things get tricky.
That's right. And this whole system of party wall regulations is a good example of how the law tries to balance the rights of individual property owners while also making sure that construction projects can be carried out safely and considerately.
Okay, so we've explored easements, freehold covenants, and party walls. It seems like there are all these hidden legal threads that connect our properties and influence how we build and live. Pretty fascinating stuff.
It is. And understanding these concepts is essential for anyone involved in real estate or the construction industry.
Totally agree. Now, this deep dive has taken us from the ancient history of land ownership to the modern world of planning permission, building regulations, site safety, even these legal intricacies of party walls. It's been quite a journey. But before we wrap up this part, I'm curious about the people who actually live and work in these buildings. How do all these regulations impact their experiences?
That's a great question. It's easy to get lost in the technicalities and the legal details, but ultimately, building regulations are all about people. They're about creating spaces that aren't just safe and functional, but also comfortable, enjoyable, and good for people's well-being.
So it's not just about ticking boxes and meeting codes. It's about designing buildings that actually improve people's lives.
Exactly. And this human-centered approach to building regulations is becoming more and more important as we face challenges like climate change, growing cities, and the need for more sustainable and resilient communities.
It's like we're shifting our perspective from seeing buildings as just structures to seeing them as living, breathing ecosystems that support human life.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the shift is reflected in the way we design and build things. We're seeing a much bigger emphasis on things like natural light, ventilation, thermal comfort, and acoustics.
So it's about bringing the outdoors in, making spaces that feel bright, airy, and connected to nature.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the physical aspects. There's also a focus on designing buildings that encourage social interaction and create a sense of community.
So it's about creating spaces that bring people together.
Absolutely. Think about spaces like parks and plazas. They're designed to encourage social interaction. We can apply those same principles to buildings, from apartment buildings to offices to schools and hospitals.
That's a cool way to think about it. Now, this human-centered approach also includes accessibility, right? Making sure buildings are designed to accommodate people with disabilities.
Definitely. Building regulations play a huge role in making sure buildings are accessible to everyone. That includes things like ramps, lifts, accessible toilets, and clear signage.
So it's about removing barriers and creating an inclusive environment for people of all abilities.
Exactly. And it's not just about complying with the law, it's about creating a more equitable and just society.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to have access to and enjoy the spaces we inhabit, no matter their physical abilities.
Well said. And it all circles back to the focus of our deep dive, exploring the regulations that control design and ensure safe buildings. As we've seen, it's not just about technical specs and legal requirements, it's about shaping the human experience of these spaces.
It's about creating buildings that aren't just structurally sound, but that also improve our well-being, foster community, and promote inclusivity.
Exactly. And with that thought in mind, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. Join us again for part 3, where we'll delve even deeper into these fascinating ideas.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've covered a lot of ground, from the nitty-gritty of planning permission to the complexities of insurance. But now we're going to talk about something a little different, something we touched on last time, the emotional impact of buildings.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's like we intuitively know that a bright, open space feels different from a dark, cramped one. But now we've got research to back that up.
So it's not just about aesthetics. There's actually a science behind how design can affect our mood and how we feel.
Absolutely. Take natural light, for instance. Studies show that exposure to daylight can really improve our mental and physical well-being.
Like actually make us healthier.
It can. Better sleep, less stress, even increased productivity, all linked to natural light.
So all those companies with their fancy light-filled offices, maybe they're onto something after all.
Maybe they are. And it's not just about natural light. The colors we use, the textures, even how the furniture is arranged, it all plays a role.
So you're saying design choices can actually trigger different emotional responses.
Exactly. For example, cool colors like blues and greens, they tend to create a sense of calm and tranquility. But warm colors like reds and yellows, those can be more stimulating, more energizing.
So it's like buildings have their own emotional language, a way of communicating with us through design.
That's a great way to put it. And architects are becoming increasingly aware of this. They're using principles from psychology, even neuroscience, to design spaces that are not just functional, but emotionally supportive as well.
So it's like they're creating spaces that can actually make us feel better just by being in them.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning, really. Think about hospitals that feel more like peaceful retreats, schools that spark curiosity and wonder, offices that actually inspire creativity.
That's amazing. So we've gone from discussing ancient land taxes to cutting-edge design principles that consider human emotions. It really shows how far we've come in understanding how buildings affect us.
It's an incredible journey, and it's still unfolding. As we move forward, it's crucial to see building regulations not just as restrictions, but as tools. Tools to create a world that is safe, sustainable, and, yes, emotionally fulfilling.
That's a great point. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of building regulations and safety laws.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From the historical roots of land ownership to the future of sustainable design.
It really has. Thanks for joining us on this exploration. We hope you've learned something new and maybe gained a fresh perspective on the buildings around us. And who knows, maybe you'll even notice those design details a little more now, those subtle cues that can shape how you feel in a space.
It's amazing when you start to see the thought and intention behind all of it.
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious.